The land, the animals, and the people. Welcome to the Wolf Connection Podcast.
All right, so today we continue talking about, it seems as though we're really getting into policy in these last three podcasts. We spoke with John Vucetich, we spoke with Leah Miranda, and now today we get to speak with the executive director and founder of Friends of the Wisconsin Wolf and Wildlife, also the Great Lakes Wildlife Alliance. And she also has a background in wildlife policy, government affairs, and we can start to talk a little bit more about the state things and hopefully tools that will be able to help some of these species issues and also the environmental issues that we sort of see coming down the pike when we talk about roadless rule and things like that. And she is Melissa Smith. Melissa, it's great to have you. How are you doing today?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing okay today.
That's good. That's good. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. Just give everybody a little bit of a background for yourself. I know you grew up in Wisconsin. What is that area like for you in terms of gaining that love of nature and the environmental influence that leads you sort of into the work that you're doing now and wanting to be involved in policy, government affairs, and really getting into the language of the stuff we're going to be talking about today about, state management and things like that?
Sure. I was born in Indiana.
Indiana, okay.
And moved here when I was young into Madison, Wisconsin. My dad is a research scientist, so we moved here so he could be a research scientist. So I've kind of always had science-minded things. But from a very early age, I have always been fascinated by wildlife, and for a reason I cannot put down. But I volunteered with everything I could get my hands on. Even in Indiana all the way to here, I would beg my parents to go to all of these walks and nature talks. And even when we went camping, they'd have I still even remember the songs like, "Why would a beaver go to a department store?" I mean, I really remember all of these ridiculous things. And just growing up knowing that Wisconsin was the leader in environmental not activism, but that our own state and our own state agency was something to be envied. This was the place. This is where John Muir was born. This is where Aldo Leopold was born. This is where Earth Day originated. We'd always been the green leaders, and that was something to really be proud of. And also just being very justice oriented. I've always been kind of justice oriented. When I see something wrong, I wanted to fix it. So growing up here, I did all those things until one day I had the realization, and it was very difficult for me. And it sounds silly now that I remember specifically that I found out that my 5th grade teacher was a hunter, and how devastated that made me feel, even though, and I'm not saying anything anti-hunting here, but, and finding out more about that a big part of the agency's job and the big part of this was not, as I had thought, was not about preservation as much. And as I got older, I moved to New Mexico. I went away to New Mexico for a while, and then I came back to Wisconsin for school. And I don't think I ever would have been a sociologist. And that, I think that's one thing why people should go to college is I started a math major. I was going to be a scientist too. And then I took an intro to social, and I was like, this is fascinating. And how could we apply this? And even early, I thought, how can we apply this? Because I think we all can say, we don't have a wolf problem. We don't have a cougar problem. We don't have an invasive species problem. We have a human problem. And it isn't the individual when it comes to these things. It's us as a collective. And I think that really got my interest of where these two worlds can kind of collide, and where we're missing a lot of that. We are missing a lot of interdisciplinary approach to wildlife and to a lot of things in our society that I think managing people is also managing wildlife, if that makes sense. But yeah, I just grew up with a fascination. I mean, I still can sit outside here for 6 hours and look at birds, and I never thought I'd become a bird person. I never thought, and now I'm like, God dang it, I got old and became a bird person. But there's a whole world going on outside where people are writing comic books about superheroes, and a peregrine falcon can dive 300 miles an hour. A cheetah can go 75 miles an hour. A wolf can take down a moose with its teeth. And we have these amazing superheroes all around that we're losing. And I think that is my raccoons are my favorite animals. Or a raccoon. These animals are smarter than most primates. And they have a whole world of, they live in bachelor groups and they have fun and they sleep with possums and skunks in the winter. They're all curled up together for heat up here. There's so much we don't know about even our own backyard that I think if we did, would make things better. Wildlife is always a problem before they're anything else. And that I think we can change.
You said a lot of very interesting things there, and it's okay. No, it's great. And look, there's no shame in saying the raccoon is your favorite animal. I mean, we all grew up. Cute. They're cool. I mean, look, I grew up with Ranger Rick, so that was one of my first things. Ranger Rick was great. The one thing that I love that you brought in, and it seems the longer we've been doing this podcast, the more we really have sort of dove into not just the biological research, like I think your dad was probably part of, and we talk about science research, but we talk about the sociological and the sociological and the ecological sort of mirroring one another, and economically and how that matters. Why the draw to sociology, and where are the parallels that you've seen as it pertains to environmental policy? Why is sociology so important to have in the conversation when we talk about science in particular, so that people understand that it is a science and that it can go hand in hand with research?
Because a lot of our values, a lot of times when we think of our values, individual values, they're actually kind of societal values. So let me give you an example, and not to be controversial. My dad is an mRNA scientist, a purification scientist. He can develop and help develop and get vaccines out to people in a time of a pandemic. But if the people do not have trust in the government, if society is not going to be open to that science, developing something is not, and we've seen some backlash from that, but that part is just as important, if that makes sense, is government trust, and what are the values of society, and do we believe in community, and is it individualistic, is it traditional, is it what are the values we have towards wildlife in that same text? So are we traditionalists? Do we need to dominate everything? Is that who we are anymore? Is it that we that we want to walk side by side? Is it that we have, more that our society now wants to be not so colonial and, more inclusive and understand biodiversity, that nature isn't something we just take from, that belongs to us. It's not that it's something that we are part of. So instead of being on the top of the food chain, that we're part of that circle. And that's what's really important, I think, when it does come to wildlife management and policy and to wolves, is that when those mismatch, that's when you have the fight that you do on the horizon. And that mismatch, traditionalists are going way of the world. They tend to be older white males. They just do. That's a sociological term. When the rest of us tend to be that we're not into trophy hunting anymore. We're not into managing in that same way. And that mindset is what is so important. It's not that they're bad or good. It is a mindset that we are going in with that says, how does society see wildlife? Do we see them as something, and those values, and, not so much psychology, although some of it comes into it, is and how does that change? Like, how do we go from being traditionalists, and what's not working anymore? So I think that that's really important too. Certainly, from a sociological perspective, there have been many groups of people who have been left out. Traditional knowledge has been left out. Women have been left out. And with more women being involved, more recognition of traditional tribal values. And that's science. I mean, there is real science. This isn't just aren't just myths. There is reason behind all of this, and starting to incorporate that and involve, and we talked about that before, changes how we see wildlife, and that it should encompass more views, I guess I should say.
Yeah, and you stated a lot of this stuff wonderfully in that when we look at it, and I love the zoom out approach and what you were saying, and I just finished for the first time reading Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac. So for me,
okay, that's about 40 minutes from my house.
Yeah, it's just such a perspective that I don't know, that I'm sure there are a lot of people that have read it, but reading the intricacies of what he's describing when he talks about the value of wildlife and the things you talk about societally and what we look at the intrinsic value, and I spoke about this with John Vucetich, is as a human species, as a society of who we are, we always look for the value of something and not thinking that, hey, we're, like you said before, we're in the circle together, as opposed to thinking that we are the ones actually turning the cog. We are actually part of the cog that's making the machine work and balancing that together. So when we look at environmental policy, Melissa, and we go to the state level, because these are, I think, everybody's go-to, or sort of the initial response when any sort of species, whether it be flora or fauna or some sort of big policy, is to look federally and say, how do we change this at the largest level possible? When in reality, it seems like a lot can be done in the smaller, like even the town level, the state level. These are things that could really start to make the ripple effects to help that. So when we look at state management, just explain briefly, if you can, what the role is of a SESA, which is a State Endangered Species Act. I know not every state has them, but what if your state does have one? What's sort of the policy there, and what is it able to help in situations like when we're looking at state management?
Yeah, and ours, it is supposed to be more prevention. So to stop species from reaching to that federal level. Some species are going to need that. I mean, no doubt about it. But we could be on a state level working towards true biodiversity goals. And certainly our state, and now granted we're underfunded, but really the purpose is that there are species that are very local. I mean, that you're going to, lake sturgeon, for example, in Wisconsin, the last stranglehold is Lake Winnebago. That's it. That's it worldwide. Now, I have a different opinion on whether they should be protected or not, but it is, in a perfect world, and if it worked that way, is that you're looking at your local population and saying, okay, if our local population isn't doing well, then how are they doing compared to my region, to the state? And really being able to have a stop prevention measure on when animals get to the Federal Endangered Species Act, they are in trouble. That is an extinction plan, not a recovery plan, not a like, oh, they're not doing good plan. That is a stop extinction plan. And the states in the perfect world, would be taking those species and still knowing that either we want to stop them from getting, the goal should be from stopping anything. We don't want species on the Endangered Species Act, right? Like, we don't want that. And the states have a lot of power and a lot of, I think, sociologically speaking, I think people are a lot more open to it when it is their project. They're not being told to do, but they're giving the instructions to. And I think that that's pretty important, and that's what the state's going to do. But each state threatened species list is different, but there has been a move to really strengthen those so that when politics does come into play, that's trying to word this in a good way. When politics becomes extreme, that there is a backstop measure as well. So if the Endangered Species Act is federally is dissolved or rendered inefficient, I guess is the right word, that there's still something there to protect. Not to mention, you've got local scientists, you've got people that are able to look at that. The federal government does not have infinite resources either. So this should be working in conjunction, not to mention there's partnerships between the federal government and the state. And the federal government has a vested interest to keep U.S. Fish and Wildlife, to keep species off the Endangered Species Act as well. It is in our laws that states are the ones who should be managing wildlife. So essentially, they should be managing threatened and endangered species. It depends on the species, but some are interstate, like Migratory Bird Act and those things. But if we can also sound the alarm, if wolves aren't doing well in Wisconsin, then we can sound an alarm to other states. And I just threw wolves in there. I mean, any species. But I think when you have people think globally, act locally. When did we learn that? In like the second grade? It's no less important today. And I think that there is a reliance on federal government for endangered species work for some good reason and not. But it doesn't have to be that way. It shouldn't be that way. We shouldn't have to rely on that. And I guess that's it. The other part too is that they don't have to necessarily match. We can say, in our state, this plant, the pitcher plant is not doing well here, for example. The pitcher plant, it's doing fine in Alabama, but it's not doing well here. What are those reasons? And then make changes to management so that, what is Alabama doing differently that we're not doing, that the pitcher plant isn't doing here? And then we can really look at our state policies, that's what matters. I mean, we can have federal government say that they're endangered, but if we're not doing the on the ground education outreach to people and management policy on the state level, we're not going to save it. So then we can have some comparison that way. But yeah, the pitcher plant's not doing good.
When we look at this stuff and you talk about it, let's just look at the pitcher plant as an example, and the education and the information that gets out there. Is there, I guess this is kind of a two-part in some way. When we look at the way maybe that state management was set up from the very beginning, or just looking at the way it's enacting now, we see certain states taking very large swings in either direction, and most of it is to inhibit the recovery of certain species and things of that sort. Were these agencies necessarily set up to succeed in this aspect of what their job should be? Because when I spoke with John Vucetich, it seemed to be some of what I think we're coming to the realization of is that we were set up in one way to sort of promote certain activities. And now realizing as you said, some of these state agencies are underfunded. They might not have the resources to enact the policies that maybe the public and the public trust are saying, hey, we have a problem with the pitcher plant. We have a problem with the trout. We have a problem with wolves in terms of we're seeing sort of these ecosystems dissipate. And are there, like you say, backstop measures in place at the state level for these things to be taken care of? Or are they sort of fighting a losing battle in what you could see?
Well, we're losing. Every state is losing. We are losing biodiversity as fast as we can. Yes, and I have a feeling I know what John Vucetich said about that, but that there is, and this is where the sociology comes, there is a preference for game species. And what is good for a deer or a bear is not necessarily good for a pitcher plant. And I think it's not that hunters haven't been good conservationists or given that money, but the policies around that. In Wisconsin, state wildlife management is funded by hunters, fishers, and trappers. You can buy a license plate, you can do these things, but I think a lot of folks, including myself, feel that we are also sitting on a huge tapped resource, right? Like that, for example, when you have a mass shooting at a school, which nobody wants, conservation funds almost double in our state because people run out and buy more firearms or weapons. That money goes to conservation. These are the things that we have to decide in society. Well, okay, so we've had this set up that it is, ammo and firearms that primarily fund wildlife conservation, and that's been intentional. Well, what about hiking equipment and camping equipment and canoes and those sorts of things too? And that has been very difficult to those traditional values. So they don't want to give up. Power and control are important. And when you start looking at all these things of how is it funded? How does this happen? It's very difficult for me to, when that is the scenario. National wildlife refuges, they are funded also by weapons, foreign weapons that come in, by the tax that we provide for weapons that come in from other countries. That's how they're funded. And a lot of people don't know those funding and things like that. I think I might have went off on a tangent there a little bit, but those mechanisms and how that work, those are intentional systems. That is why sociology matters. That we are looking at also, these are systems of how wildlife management works. We can say biodiversity, all of these things, but if all of the money is coming from excise taxes on weapons or guns or hunting licenses, they're going to be beholden to those interests. And I'm sorry to say, it's not that I don't think there are good guys out there. It's kind of a trickle down theory that's not working. It's not working. I just talked to Don Weller, who is a professor of evolutionary biology here at university, or now retired, but over 30% of our plant species. I know that nobody wants to talk about plants, but I do. They are endangered or extinct, including our trees, because of deer, not because of habitat loss for those species, because we have way, way, way too many deer, but we're managing deer so that people are successful in the hunts. And there you go. That's why we also want to, they want to reduce wolves. They want to reduce these things. We are not managing for biodiversity as much as maybe the mission of the departments. That is another reason why these swaps and the state threatened and endangered are so important. So that's what we can look at and say, okay, on a state level, what are we mismanaging? What can we do better to ensure these on a state level? The federal government doesn't tell us how to manage deer. They'll tell us, here's some funding, figure out how to save the pitcher plants. But if we don't know what we're doing here, that by, putting all this corn and cutting down trees and, destroying wetlands and all of the places that these, plants and trees should be. I mean, the Northwood should be a diverse place of trees. It's not. They're gone. They are extinct. They're gone. And that's because of overpopulation of deer. So, I mean, really looking at this holistically might be one way that should work.
Right. When you talk about that, and because when you sent me the email initially to have this conversation, there were a lot of interesting terms that you use, and I think these are things that people should be aware of too. And the verbiage and the language and the way that things are structured over time, which I also believe is an education in and of itself for anyone who's either listening to us talking or hopefully goes and looks up, hey, does my state have a SESA at this point, or do they not? And why is that not the case? When you talk about these regulatory things or the repercussions of, like you say, too much corn, cutting down these trees, losing the biodiversity battle in this way, why is it that some of these SESAs are inadequate in their as a regulatory mechanism? Are those the things that make them inadequate because of the way that policy is written? And what's a way that you could find a scenario to make them an adequate regulatory mechanism? Like, is there a pro to a SESA that's already in place? Like, let's say for Wisconsin, we'll use that, as an example. Is there some way to switch those out?
Yeah. I think that, there's always funding. There's always funding. We can talk about funding. But I mean, I think certainly the agency in itself is responsible for both. And so I think, I don't know how many deer people we have versus a very limited endangered resource department. And, these are conversations we could be having. I think one of those things, too, is that we're inviting outside independent science. And this is where, again, the agency hires biologists for the most part, almost exclusively, and wildlife management biologists. That's one avenue that we could. Should we try looking at this in a way, just like we're looking for the biodiversity? Should we be hiring veterinarians? And should we be hiring sociologists? And should we be hiring, look how much we know about the emotional lives of animals. We know that some animals individually matter more they are not trained that way. And so when we are trying to manage all of these species and do all of that, I think interdisciplinary is the only way we can. It's the only way we can go forward here. I was just talking to an old retired wildlife biologist, and this isn't to float my own boat, but he said, you were born 40 or 100 years too early. But I don't think so. I think that we can do this now. And I think part of that also sends the wrong message to the public that, this is how many animals we have on the landscape. Well, what does that really tell us about biodiversity? What happens to biodiversity when we remove this many animals or this many? There is no data. There's nothing. There's nothing in any of these management plans. So I think part of that problem is when you have systems that are run by traditionalists and are run by, even in our state, we call it customers. This is the agency that serves the public, right? But they consider hunters, trappers. It even says it. I get you my card. Customers. We're not customers. We should be managing this for all people, right? But we're not. And that, that is really where, some sociological studies can come in is, why do hunters feel like if we restrict one kind of hunting, that then we're going to come for all hunting when it's not true? And figuring they do believe that, like the slippery slope. Or on the other hand of it, that if, they decide, even though I absolutely, let me just tell you, empirically disagree with recreational wolf hunting. If they were to kill for wolves, is the whole system going to melt down? No, it's not. But those are not wildlife management decisions. Those are sociological decisions. Those are participating here. And so how we want to structure and how we want to take our state is what then becomes more important. Our state endangered list, our swap. Is it which is more important? And unfortunately, because of the way that it's a systemic problem, it is a pay-to-play system that favors hunting interests, and they are not aligned with biodiversity. They're just not.
When we look at it sociologically too, and I'd love to, once you answer this, I'd love to see like how can we actually let me ask this first. So if we're looking at this from a macro view and we say we have these issues and these things in place that aren't allowing the entirety of the populace to be involved, considered, and to have all voices heard, to have these SESAs or swaps matter. What are some mechanisms then that can make this stuff adequate, make these policies adequate enough so that we're doing the due diligence as a public and as all groups involved, hunting, conservation, whatever, so that everybody has an equal step at the table? Because you wrote some wonderful things in here. We're talking about binding commitments, clear enforcement provisions. What types of things would those look like if we were to if we had the ability to scrap it and say, okay, from scratch, these are things that could make it work in your eyes?
Public funding. This should not be a play-to-play model. This should be, whether it's, 0.1% tax on sales, however we need to fund this, it needs to be publicly funded. It needs to not be a reliance on. And I truly do have empathy for the folks at the agency. I was just talking just in a meeting yesterday of what a hard spot that can be, because if they are fighting for this thing, if they do want this, then the blowback is hunter success and all of these things. If license sales were not, if wildlife science and wildlife management was not contingent on license sales, what would it look like then? Would we invest as much money in snowshoe hares as we would in white-tailed deer? Now, it's deer here are still a cash cow. They're going to be. Nowhere do I see. Here's a good example. How many lives are saved by wolves by not hitting a deer with your car? Nobody wants to hit a deer with their car. It's awful. And almost everybody in Wisconsin has done it at least once. I have not, knock on wood. Insurance companies, these are lives. These are human lives. And wolves not only human lives, but millions and millions of dollars, stopping that from happening. But that's not part of state wildlife management. That's on the outside. But should it be? Should we be taking all of these factors, financial factors, social factors here, into these conversations? Maybe insurance agents should be there saying, hey, you know what? I want wolves. I'm tired of paying out. I'm tired of paying out for this. Or funeral directors saying, I just buried a 9-year-old child with a deer collision. Those voices, I think, are so important. And we always talk about education. The agency's job is education. Yes, we can all say that our job as nonprofits or anything, that it's our job. I work for an organization that education is not our job. We're in advocacy. Now, sure, education is a part of it. The agency has a duty, I think, to bring forward all that science. And the way that they are entrapped and encased by hunting interests, those kinds of studies are pushed down. So if a false statement is made in the news, I think that the agency should say, well, no, but actually that's not true. But that never happens. And so I think even really in media, and to say, my gosh, what would happen if you said, my job is to study wildlife populations. My job isn't to decide what to do with those wildlife populations. That's where the agency is making it is a top-down science. It is a push-down science. It is not empirical. And what we decide, just like with the vaccine study I said before, we can develop a vaccine, but what we decide to do with it, that's also a science, but we don't do that. And I don't think that's fair for biologists. They can tell us population numbers, but that doesn't tell us what we should do with those population numbers. And that's where that comes down to is it best available science? Not when you're making a recommendation. The recommendation is ours.
And so we're looking at, in your perspective, to really bring this to so that people have, because when we talk about this and when you some of the things that you sent me to about science-based threshold triggers, stable and dedicated funding, which you said obviously have public funding for these. What's standing in the way, and how can we also, because look, I know individuals that hunt as well. Where is it said to that we can humanize? And I think this is part of the issues that we go down the road in some of these conversations. And it's humanizing people, I think, on both ends of the spectrum, which is what we try to do, is to really show that not all people on one side are included in X group and all people on the other side are not included in Y group. There's such a wide varying of perceptions and personalities and things like that. So where is the humanization in this, and understanding that certain people do it for tradition, other people do it for sustenance, other people, whatever it may be. And this is talking about conservation, we're talking about hunting and all these other things. And it's really, to me, it's about bringing a collective together. So how are some ways that we can humanize all of these individuals and these groups so that we're working together towards a common goal sociologically? Like you said, I know there's so many barriers there, but what in some of these swaps or SESAs would give people the onus or the want to be involved and find common ground solutions sort of in the middle? Sure.
Well, and most of those are going to be agency personnel. Most people don't even know about them. They don't even know that they exist.
Right.
So that's one. But I think, why don't we see a large number of mainstream hunters come forward? Why? I think studying that. Why? What is it that we need to do in order to have them come forward? Is it that they believe that we're all Burns on lab PETA activists? That's not true either. And I think most people who have been in this long enough kind of know that. Now, the problem is that you're going to get people who scream the loudest, that vocal minority of people that scream the loudest. Well, guess what? They are listened to. That's why they do it. That's why they scream loudest. What can we do to, should there be rules in participation? I mean, here in Wisconsin, people do not want to go and participate because they are intimidated and yelled at and threatened. There was a fist fight at one of our Conservation Congress meetings. And the fact that the agency is not doing that, not making these meetings accessible for all people, that's one of the big ones. We can also, if you want to go down a sociological, there's an excellent professor who does a whole study of why this would be, and it's outgroup anxiety. Hunters are less likely to say something. They may not agree with it, but they won't say anything because they have an anxiety of going outside that group. They'll be labeled as now the other, as being labeled as our side.
Could it be seen the other way too? If there's a conservationist that sees the side of the hunting community in some way, like we have this, right? Go ahead. So it swings both ways, and I think that's what people sometimes look at is we're all human and we all have this need to have our voice heard, but we have these invisible barriers in between that we put up for ourselves sociologically, as you state, to not want to be involved at our own state level because of fear of repercussion from the other side.
And the other thing is that I think a lot of these systems are new to non-hunters, that this is new. As those values, as traditionalist values change to being more, side by side. For example, I don't think a wolf is above me and I don't think a wolf is below me. I think we're just trying to get through this the same as everybody else. And there's a lot of things here too. Here's an example of that on both sides. Native Americans XYZ, XYZ, or on the other side, Native Americans XYZ, X. Well, first of all, they're not a homogenous group. These are separate nations, and that's the pro-wolf side needs to not group everybody and every nation that they are the same. Now, we happen to have Anishinaabe or Ojibwe tribes here that do feel that way, but that's not to say the Colville tribe will feel the same way. And I think not understanding that there are differences here for the same reason of hunters. You're going to have the hunter nation folks. They are going to be crazy. They're going to be crazy. They are the trophy hunters. They don't care about science. This is what they want. They don't want any wolves on the landscape. They make up lies. They do all these things, but that's them too. But I will catch myself doing too, like, oh, I'm so sick of hunters. And maybe, but I do feel like, is there something we can do to help them come forward? But at the same time, I can also understand, like, you guys are the ones that have all the guns and all the stuff. Like, what are you afraid of? Is making sure that also hunters are making that division between this is the Ted Nugent type and this is the Aldo Leopold type of hunter, right? And I think that on our side, we also need to make sure that there are things based in fact. But, and I think we've briefly talked about this, the best way to do that is with storytelling. Because and we just have a tendency to do that to group people. And I am not immune from it. I'm not immune from it. There will never be anyone who can tell me a reason that trapping is okay. For me, it's just one of the worst things that you could do to a wild animal, because you are trapping it in, that you are taking away what makes it very wild, right? And the pain and this. But if you're going around saying that the traps have big leg hold spikes, well, they don't. That is another thing, is making sure that we are factual. And those good hunters and trappers, I even have bear hounding folks that I could even now consider friends, which is very difficult for me. Very difficult. But they can tell me how systems work when I'm making assumptions. We make a lot of assumptions on both sides. So that, I think, would be the value in those stories and trying to be over, is that even if you're trying to win a campaign and you don't like what they're doing, I do not like what they're doing. But now I understand what a bolt action rifle is. Now I understand what would an ethical houndsman be? What do they think within their own communities? So I think that is helpful. And those were just done person to person, building relationships and hearing stories. If somebody ever would have told me I would have had a bear hounding friend, I would have been like, no, absolutely not. I can't stand any of those people. But I don't. But now, now I do. So I think, and it's very difficult. And there's people that you're not, and there's people you're not going to want to be, but they're out there. And being open to that. I will say those folks came to me and said, you don't seem as extreme. I am. I probably am, but maybe just being a little more open to not an understanding. It's very difficult. I'm open to hearing their story. That's it. But usually that story can convince me that they're human, even though I may come in that way.
The Wolf Connection podcast is now sponsored by our new partner, Jacques-Marie Mage. This LA-based brand is known for their limited edition, handcrafted eyewear and luxury goods, but also for their stewardship program, which supports various nonprofits and individuals who are working to protect a future for wild wolves.
I think there's always a human element to this, and this is why we really try to be as inviting as we are, at least on this podcast, is that we want to hear all sides, because everybody does deserve a voice in any of these scenarios. And when we look at it on the state level, when we talk about the things that we've sort of glossed over with, SESAs and swaps and how they're not, it's not common knowledge for folks. And I think this is where folks sort of divide themselves up into group A or group B, whatever that may be. Like how are people able to then, if they look at sort of their own state, if we look at Wisconsin and we see that we're having issues with certain wildlife, flora, fauna, whatever it is, and we see that the agency isn't necessarily funded the way they need to be funded and the regulatory mechanisms aren't there, how are we as a society able to help with the future management of this stuff? In other words, what would make swaps and SESAs be more effective if the total part of the public is one unifying voice, as opposed to some extremes on either end and then some in the middle that just don't really know what to do? What's the best way to get people to know this stuff?
And starting there, and we're at the beginning there are very few people in those things. It's usually interagency, but when they think of stakeholders, they think of the people they've already been working with. And it's our job, I think, to say, hey, we're stakeholders too. Let us tell us your let me tell you our story. And they're often like, oh, you're not as extreme as we thought you were. Well, no, we have the same shared goals here. And that is I think the hard part. Now, granted, working within the system in some places is not going to work. It's just not. And you have to be able to, read those assessments of who's there. Am I going to have a conversation with Cody Roberts and we're going to come to an agreement? No. But most people aren't Cody Roberts. And so I think but a lot of wolf hunting is. So if we can come forward and say, okay, and I'm just using this as an example with wolves, that this man did this horrendous act and this is horrible, that this isn't isolated, and that how many hunters were like, this is unacceptable. I was surprised. How many hunters were like, this is not hunting. They may be in favor of wolf hunting or something like that, but I mean, the fact that we would even have to pass a law to outlaw running animals over with a snowmobile. But, if you can find, and unfortunately, you got to get in the door. Sometimes you can work it from the inside the system and sometimes you can't. But if you want, that is a regulatory thing. I mean, that's something that could be easily done. If I were to go to a group of hunters that I even didn't like, and maybe not wolf hunters in Wisconsin, as they did the same thing, but I was going to go to any other mainstream hunter, and you know what I mean by mainstream hunter, and say, do you think I should be able to run over deer with my snowmobile, throw that deer in my truck, take that deer to a bar? There isn't one deer hunter that would say yes. And so being able to, I think, and that's what I mean, tell a story and say, well, that's what just happened, and put it in their frame, or I'm sure, why did that story bother me so much? Imagine if somebody did that to my dog or my child. I mean, really. And I guess I'm kind of going off here, but I mean, how many hunters approved of what Cody Roberts did? Almost none. Except for it's those same vocal, loud minority people that are running the agency, because I do think we're new to this. This has been a long tradition of 100 years of hunters, trappers, and fishermen and the agency doing this. Opening the door is going to be hard for them too. We are new to this. We have to learn it. But nobody likes animal cruelty like that, I don't think. And we can have those arguments later down the road, but that's what happens when you only use population data and you don't use ethics or sociology or evolutionary biology or any of the other sciences to determine how many wolves you should have in your state. So not, the way that you have them doesn't matter at all. That's ridiculous. So I think, that's where the states could come in, and that we could come in as non-hunters and say, do you see how the public sees you? How can we make this, and I think that that's true. A lot of the public does not look favorably on hunters anymore. They just don't. And they don't want to participate.
And I think these are tough conversations to have. And I think I think there's an understanding that some of this stuff starts small on a state level and then grows into a federal conversation when we talk about, obviously, incidents, when we see Cody Roberts, when we see other things happening. I think it's just looking at the mechanisms, I guess, not being in place from the get-go. And as you said, sociologically, we're sort of in this pattern, I guess is the best word to use, that has been going on for a century plus, or maybe depending upon whenever these agencies were formed, right? And sort of breaking the pattern so that everyone has the opportunity to say, hey, the mechanism isn't working as I would have hoped in doing my research and looking up, the SWAP or the SESA or even just any regulatory measure within the state. So how do people, when they look at this from the outside and they're listening to this conversation, what's the best course of action for them to get involved or see if there's something in their state that they're able to not only look up, but to, if it's there, how to get involved in saying, I'm looking through these regulatory measures. It doesn't really match up with how I feel. How do I get into the conversation with any elected official or the officials of the agency to find out what the processes are in place to keep the environment, the ecology at a stable place so that these mechanisms are there for everyone?
First, and we know that, like, learning about that, learning from organizations like ours, like what, we tend to say, like, yes, we advocate for wildlife, but we advocate for advocates. So they know what's going on, like what is happening here. When is a place where I can testify? Where is an opportunity I can participate? And then also knowing reform is hard, and you've got to be able to really think about the long game. If you can't, it's heartbreaking. And a lot of people have been like, throw their arms up. But when you can stay in that long game and say, okay, if they hear from us once, twice, it's going to take more than one time to testify on something or to say, my voice doesn't matter. Now, with our organization, we had to litigate to the agency to say, hey, the public voices matter here, and still in appellate court with that. But reforming these systems is not easy. But we live in a democracy. And demanding accountability, transparency, and democracy from your federal agency or your local agency or your federal agency is not wrong. And that's okay to do. And it's okay to know that most of the time, any good reform, it's not the big guys who win it. It never is. It's the little guy. I'm starting to tear up about that. I still think that we can do that, but it is a frustrating process. And what is that? I mean, I don't want to mess up the quote. Like, first they think you're crazy, then they think you're something, and then you win. I can't remember the middle one. What is that quote? It's like, first they think you're crazy, then they think you are on to something, and then you win. But they're going to think that we're crazy right now. And then that's okay. But I think that's why it's so important to tell the story. It's to tell the story of why you care, because that voice is going to resonate with the people that are already in power.
Yeah. I mean, what are the stories that you can speak to? Because I know you had one or two or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, this one is a little bit long. Maybe we can end with this one, John.
Sure, yeah, we can end with that. I think, yeah. I mean, before we share the story, just I guess what's the best place? Because we know that Wisconsin has. You have a SESA or a swap or both. I can't remember what it was when you said.
We have both. Yeah,
you have both. So if people were to go there to look at this, if anyone was listening and said, "I want to see if my state has a SESA or a swap," what's the way to do that, and how can they inquire whether they're? I don't personally care where you come from on these issues. I think looking at the way the collective came together, not only on the roadless rule, which just was most recent, but on the sale of public land, to me, that is a shining beacon. I know there are some that might maybe clap back on that, but to me, that just shows collectively we have a unified voice when we look at these things. But because I believe when the rubber actually hits the road, people do not want to see these things disappear, and they treasure these wild places. They treasure these wild species. They treasure these waterways, these whatever it is that they grew up knowing. We've all had these experiences, I think, as kids, or most of us. I can't say all, most. And we're starting to come to the realization that we have to collectively stand up and have a voice to make sure that these wild places and spaces do not go to the wayside for whatever the reason may be, whatever that is. So going back to my last question, I apologize because I tangented for a second, but I think it's important. And I want that to be, that's always the goal of this, is that we unified on both ends. And this is why we want to talk to anybody and everyone who wants to come here, is that we all have a stake in this, no matter what that is. And so to protect those stakes is invaluable, I think, to the globe itself, the world itself, the natural world itself, to make sure that it continues to go on and expand. And I think that's what I'd love to see, is for us to start to expand our wild places.
Sure. And that public lands fight was not fought because a bunch of people said, don't do this, XYZ number of live on this land, A bunch of people came and said, this is why I love my public lands as an individual. They told their story. And so with that we were able to come in. The Endangered Species Act, it's 90% approval rating. 90%. It's not Republican that we can do it. Now, when it comes down to individual species, it gets harder. And these are the little small debates that we have. But I believe that 90% of the people in Wisconsin want to save threatened and endangered species in our state. I have no doubt about it. But how we got away from that and making that the reality is, we can say we all agree with it, but are we all on? And this is on our side. I will say, hunters show up and we don't. We don't show up in the same numbers. Now, granted, we tend to be younger in full-time jobs, and it's harder to participate. Those are things we could be asking for, but we need your voice. Need your voice. If you really want the agency to be striving for biodiversity, and that's their goal, and to be managing all wildlife and its systems for all of the people, then all of the people need to show up and say something. And I think that we mostly do agree. I mean, that's fluffy like stuff, but yeah, I mean, we came together for public lands, certainly that we did. And there's lots of things that, our organization signs on as a coalition that on some days I'm battling like this with National Wildlife Federation, and other days we are agreeing and working on protect the pollinators, because we all know that they're going. But when it gets down to smaller issues, and some issues are more contentious than others, especially large predators on the landscape, those are harder battles. But I think still telling that story is the way to go. And I don't have to read that. That's fine. But I think, if somebody hears something that, if I tell you the indigenous see their wolves as a brother, what does it mean to you? Or if someone comes and tells their story, what that wolf hunt was like for them, is that going to be more significant? And then we sent in our state petition. That's exactly what we did on every point, is I didn't tell their story. They told their story. A scientist told their story about what it feels like to be left out because you are not, because you are a young Black woman studying large carnivores. What it feels like to be an old scientist, and what it feels like to feel like everything you worked for 30 years to protect the animals and fish that you love is being thrown away by an administration. I can't tell those stories, but they can, and I think that's really the important part of it. We can talk about adequate regulatory mechanisms, but I think we need to be able to tell those stories too.
And I think that's the major part of a lot of this, is that we all have our unique voices, our unique stories.
Yeah.
And that more often than not, I believe those stories can cross-pollinate, if I want to use that, and really and really hit a lot of the same markers. And so that is really the goal of this, is that we're all really in this together, because if we don't, the more that we fracture and the more that we go apart, really the only thing that truly suffers, or the things that suffer will be the species, the flora, the fauna, and the ecosystems. And so together, it's always better. Melissa, so what's the best way for people to keep up, I guess, with the organization's work that you're doing, and also a way for them to look at the Wisconsin SESA or SWAP so that they can get an idea of what they may be looking for in their own state?
You can just go to dnr.wi.gov. Our website's longer. It's wiwolvesandwildlife.org. So WI as in Wisconsin. And take a look at those. We do join our mail list, and we'll let you know what's going on there. I also would encourage people to join to Endangered Species Coalition. It can give you news. That is a large coalition that we belong to, both on wolf and grizzly, and on bears and wildlife for all. All of these large, a lot of people don't know that these large coalitions that we are meeting, we are working together, that they can tell you what's going on across the country. That I think is maybe that last point, is focus on what's right in front of you. Tell the person next to you that I can report to them and say, listen, this is what's going on in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, or Illinois, or Iowa, the flyover zone. No, but that I can report that to a larger group, and that larger group can help me, because these are not individual issues. So when Colorado needs everybody to come together and help, we're ready to help Colorado, and vice versa. And I can't say enough either for coalition work. And coalition work makes you swallow your pride and your ego to get the job done. So
agreed. I think it's good. I think people, we can find the commonality and find the compromise in a lot of these issues. And I think that gives me hope for everything. I'm an eternal optimist. So it's in these times it may be tough, but boy, but that's what keeps me moving.
Times are tough.
Times are a little bit tough right now. But my last question.
For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So I do not believe that will stay like this forever.
Right. And I believe that there's, as I always say, there's more good in the world than there is bad. My last question for you, Melissa, is when you hear the word wolf, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
Wild. They represent the wild. If we can't have wolves on the landscape, we will lose. I'm starting to tear up on that too. If in the places we have wolves, we cannot beat the political systems or change the hearts and minds of after 30 years, although I do think most people do like wolves on the landscape and more. But if we can't have wolves, we can't have wild. They don't exist without it. I bet John Vucetich was so nice on here. I just love him so much.
John's great. He was great.
So she's a person who's a very good storyteller.
He's the one. You're the episode right after John. So there you go. Melissa Smith, thank you so much for going into the sociological aspect of it. And I hope everybody takes this conversation and uses it wisely. I think it's tough to talk about policy without talking about the human end of it, because we are all human, and we are the cogs or the rivets, as John would say, to keeping this thing moving and saving it all. So Melissa, thank you for your information and for your knowledge. Really appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me.
You got it. Hang tight while I sign off here. Howls to you all out there. We'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer. Thank you for listening.